plan today is to discuss two public key cryptographic algorithms that they are RSA and Diffie-Hellman public key cryptographic algorithm. Before we start the discussion, let's remind you what we discussed so far. So in this practical cryptographic course, so we're going to cover the entire cryptography domain and the application in this course. So as you may understood, we discussed cryptography, and then we said there are two types of cryptographic algorithms, asymmetric and asymmetric. In the symmetric in cryptography, there are two categories, classical cryptography and the modern cryptography. So we discussed classical cryptographic algorithms, and also we discussed now already modern cryptographic algorithms. In the modern cryptographic algorithm, there are two types, stream and the block ciphers. Most of the modern cryptographic algorithms are block ciphers. So we usually use block ciphers to generate stream of keys and convert those block ciphers to stream ciphers. Block ciphers operate in different encryption modes. So that's what we call block cipher operational modes. We heavily discuss those block cipher operational modes, because in the practically when you use cryptography, we must know those blocks, how those block cipher encryption modes work. Let me remind you the modes which we discussed. The simplest mode is called electronic codebook mode. So there we divide our messages into the block size and then individually encrypt those messages with the security key, symmetric key. So in this mode, so maybe in the last block, you need to pad. That means if you don't have exact message size, we have to pad this data. So then there is another mode called cipher block chaining mode. So where we discuss in detail. In the cipher block chaining mode, in addition to the security key, we are using what we call it as initial vector. So it has two layers of encryption. In the first layer, we have the block of our plain text. So we XOR with the initial vector and feed it into the block cipher with security key and produce this ciphertext block. So this ciphertext block considered as the initial vector to the next block. So it's kind of a sequential processing. So in this mode can be used as used to calculate the message authentication code. It's called it's message authentication code can be calculated based on this particular mode. So it's called, when you do the message authentication code calculation, it's called, it has CBC-MAC. So how do you do that? We again have initial vector and we encrypt that with the message, and then we feed it into the block cipher algorithm, and the output feed it to the next block and so on. So that is called, it has CBC-MAC. So CBC mode can be used for encryption as well as message authentication code calculation. So I forgot to mention the difference between these two. So that because of that, I added one slide here. So different security properties with that. Actually, when you use CBC mode for the encryption, first initial vector, we select a random number. In other words, it's called, it has random initial vector. But when you apply the same mode for calculation of message authentication code, first initial vector fixed to be 0. So we are not taking random initial vector. It is kind of insecure if you take a first vector as an initial vector. So perhaps I made a mistake when I do this presentation in the previous lecture. So saying in one goal we can calculate the encryption and the MAC. That is not in this. If you want to use this mode in the encryption, first we need to do the encryption, and then we want to calculate the MAC. Then we have to do it again separately in the CBC mode with initial vector 0. If you want to do the encryption, we do the encryption in the CBC initial with random initial vector. So when you want to do then the MAC calculation, message authentication calculation, we execute this our data in the CBC mode back with the initial vector 0. MAC goes with the initial vector 0. If you use a random initial vector to calculate the MAC, it's considered as insecure. So when you want MAC, actually we only take the last block. As you know, MAC is the last block, and then CBC encryption is the entire data set. So the CBC mode can be used for calculating encryption and the MAC values. So after that, we discussed several other modes which convert a block cipher into the stream cipher. Perhaps you remember one of the mode is cipher feedback mode. There we kind of feedback in the ciphertext to the top and create the stream of random number. In this mode, there is a main disadvantage where basically someone at the middle tamper it, that error gets propagated. So we discussed that in detail. And in order to overcome that, we have another mode called output feedback mode. In this output feedback mode, we are feedbacking not the ciphertext. Instead, we are feedbacking the output of the encryption to the top. If you do so, at the middle someone tamper it, it may not affect to the key generation here. So since it's not affect to the key generation here, so error may not propagate. If that error occurs in one transmission, that only affects that particular block. So that's advantage kind of in OCB mode. But a kind of a popular mode we use today for most of the applications are CTR mode, counter mode. Counter mode has various operations and various applications in different cryptography protocols we use today use counter mode, CTR mode. In the CTR mode, I said it creates a set of initial counters. So then each counter will encrypt with a security key. So output of those counter XOR with the plain text. So since they are independent each other, we can do parallel processing. Plus these counters are independently can operate, parallelly can operate. So that is kind of advantage, and counter mode used in the most of the application. I mentioned that counter mode is used in the wireless access plus TLS, that means web and so on. When you use counter mode in the TLS, transport layer security, that is when your browser accessing the kind of a web server. So counter modes sometimes operate in the Galois block counter mode or the GCM mode. In the Galois mode, what happens? Actually, they use counter mode, but same time when encryption happens, in this particular mode, calculate the what we call it as authentication tag. So those authentication tag created using the same set of initial vector and the counter. So there is initial counter, and in order to generate that initial counter, we use the initial vector. An initial counter may not encrypt it, but it used to calculate only the authentication tag, and the next counter onwards we use to encrypt the data. So each encrypted ciphertext we feed it to this Galois function, and then it kind of propagate, and finally we calculate the authentication tag. In that mode, the advantage I said, we can calculate the authentication tag. We can add unencrypted data also to the authentication tag. So like it's called unencrypted data called authentication data. Especially when you want to do security processing for the packets like that in maybe IPsec like that protocols. So we don't want to encrypt the IP header. So if IP header is get encrypted, packet cannot travel. So it keep it plain, but still we want to include IP header in the authentication tag. So that is called Galois counter mode. So when you combine this authentication and encryption in the protocols, there is an area called authenticated encryption. So that is which I didn't discuss in the last lecture. That is called as authenticated encryption. Authenticated encryption combines the confidentiality and integrity together. Galois is the major mode. Galois counter mode is the major mode which combines these two together. So basically, security, confidentiality features, basically it stop kind of having someone look at the data and stop like CCA, this is chosen ciphertext attacks, and then it could use for integrity checking as well. So then no one will be alter the ciphertext if it can detect it in the other side. So it's called it as authenticated encryption. When you do authenticated encryption, there are three possible options we have. So that's very interesting to have a look at. before we move on to the public key cryptography, because I made a mistake also in the last week lecture. I want to correct that. So in the authenticated encryption, basically we have three options. We call it as encrypt and calculate the authentication code. That is mean encrypt and MAC, and calculate the MAC and then encrypt, and then we can say encrypt, then calculate the MAC, like that. So let me explain the three different scenarios. So for example, when you use SSL, secure shell, so practically when you want to connect to the remote servers using a prompt, terminal, using SSL, it uses the first option. So it calls it as encrypt and MAC. So there, what usually we do, we encrypt our message using a security key, encryption key K1, and then we create the ciphertext. You see, we have the ciphertext, and we add an authentication tag. Authentication tag created on the message. So that is what we call encrypt and MAC. So authentication tag goes with the key 2, but this tag authentication data create on the message. That means it create on the plain text. It's not create on the ciphertext. So then attach to the message. So if someone alter the message, then as someone alter the ciphertext, then during the communication, that tag may not detect it, because this tag is authentication tag is created based on the plain text, or what we call it as message. So SSH uses it, and then the other option is MAC then encrypt. So it uses by SSL, or what we call TLS or SSL protocol, the web protocol. So there what we do, we have a message, we calculate the authentication tag, we put the message and the authentication tag together, then encrypt. So it calls it as MAC then encrypt. So we can first calculate the authentication tag in this mode using the authentication key. So we add the authentication tag to the message, and all together we do the encryption. So then we have encrypted a message plus authentication tag. So if someone kind of tamper that, actually decryption may not happen on the other side. So obviously then it can detect it. But in this mode, we have some particular attacks which developed by different people, all chosen plain text attacks. With that, basically the kind of attacker can be able to derive those keys. So even the SSL use this mode. Basically, we recommend not to do that. Recommended mode actually used by IPsec. So in this mode, what happens? First of all, we encrypt our packets, and then we calculate the authentication tag of the ciphertext. So that's called encrypt then MAC. So we calculate the ciphertext, and this message authentication code actually calculated on the ciphertext. You see here it calculates on the message M. Here we calculate on the ciphertext C. So that is the most famous and most popular mode of use. Actually, Galois is kind of such mode, encrypt then MAC, because it encrypts the data plain text and then feed it that ciphertext, encrypt the plain text to the ciphertext, then feed that ciphertext to calculate the MAC. If you understand that, when we go back to this, you see here. So in this mode, we do the ciphertext calculation first, and then passes to the authentication code calculation. That is actually encrypt then MAC, encrypt then MAC. So this is this mode. So the mistake I done, actually I repeatedly say Galois mode used by the WPA2 protocol in my previous lecture. That was a mistake I did. WPA2 protocol use actually what we call it as CCM, CCM mode. So WPA2 protocol, perhaps you know, it's the protocol, security protocol used to encrypt the communication between the Wi-Fi endpoint and the access point. So when you talk to your phone through the Wi-Fi to the access point, or your mobile phone or your laptop through Wi-Fi connected to the access point, it uses WPA2 protocol. In the WPA2 protocol, in the last lecture, I noticed I said it uses Galois counter mode. Actually, it's not. So it uses most of the WPA2 protocol. I noticed it uses what we call it as CCM mode, where we don't discuss. Actually, we discuss the component of those CCM modes. CCM mode is not a new thing. It actually do counter mode and the CBC-MAC in 2 rounds. So, for example, encryption goes with the counter mode, plain counter mode, as we discussed in the previous lecture. So, encryption in the WPA2 protocol, encryption goes with the counter mode. After it encrypts the data, it executes the message authentication code calculation based on the CBC mode. So CBC mode used for calculate the message authentication code. So we first encrypt the data, create the ciphertext. Ciphertext passes to calculate the message authentication code. Then attach the ciphertext to the message. That is encrypt then MAC kind of protocol. It is CCM. It's the two modes used together. The counter mode, and then independently it calculates the counter mode, and then after that CBC-MAC. So that is what WPA2 use, not the Galois counter mode. WPA2 use CCM mode. So CCM mode is combination of CTR, that is counter mode, plus CBC-MAC. So that's what I want to correct. Right. That's kind of end of the symmetric key block cipher discussion. So we had a very long discussion on symmetric key algorithms. So like days, triple days, AES, and so on. And then long discussion on the practical operational modes of symmetric key encryption. So we basically discussed 5 standard modes. So if I conclude those modes, they are ECB, CBC, Cipher blockchaining, output feedback, and counter modes. And then some protocols combine CBC-MAC, CBC mode in the message authentication code calculation together with the counter mode, and some alter the counter mode with the Galois function and create a Galois counter mode. So these two are the kind of popular methods used in the network communication protocols. So now in the today, what we're going to discuss is actually public key cryptography, public key cryptographic algorithms. In the public key cryptography algorithm, before I start this discussion on public key cryptography algorithm, we have to understand why we need this new kind of cryptographic algorithms. So basically in the symmetric key encryption, you realize that, so we have a serious problem of what we call it as key distribution problem. So that means if a sender generates a symmetric key for the encryption of the data, he has to transmit data to the other side, plus he has to transmit the key to the other side. So we can transmit the data, no issue with that. But if you transmit the key through the same channel, someone will access this key. So then he can take this key to decrypt the data. So that means we cannot use the same channel to share our secret. So in somewhere in 1970s, people were looking for solutions for this. So because at that 90s we had only DES algorithm, people were looking for some methods to overcome this key distribution problem. And then there is another problem with this symmetric key encryption. So that is what we call it as scalability problem. So if you have kind of n number of keys in which the n number of nodes in the network, and we need to have n multiply n minus 1 divide 2 number of symmetric keys to talk to each other in secure manner. So then it's in other words, the keys required exponentially increase m if nodes increase. So that is kind of a 2 major disadvantage of asymmetric key encryption. So these 2 disadvantages can overcome using public key cryptography. Today let's try to discuss 2 of those public key cryptography algorithms, call it as Diffie-Hellman and RSA. Before we start the discussion, we need to first understand the concepts of public key encryption. Then need to understand a little bit of mathematical foundations or mathematical background of this public key encryption. So basically, in the public key encryption mainly developed to address key distribution issue. That can be used in, not only the key distribution, that can be used to address some other issues as well. So for example, we can use those public key cryptography to solve the authentication issue as well. So when you use the public key cryptography for authentication, it call it as digital signatures. So digital signatures can be used to verify the messages. So there are several public key cryptographic protocols available. So main ingredients of this public key cryptography system are plain text, encryption algorithm, public and private key, ciphertext, and decryption algorithm. So as you may see, when you use symmetric key cryptography also, we had plain text, encryption algorithm, but we have only one key, that is a symmetric key. But in the public key cryptography algorithm, we have two keys. So they are called as public and private keys. And then obviously we have ciphertext and the decryption algorithm. Then I mentioned like this algorithm, algorithm wise also symmetric. That means encryption and the decryption algorithms are identical, like this cryptography, this encryption standard. But when we use, when I discuss advanced encryption standard, I mentioned, so we use two different algorithms for that. Encryption is one algorithm and decryption is the other algorithm. So in the public key cryptography, always encryption and the decryption are two different algorithms. And we have two different keys, what we call it as public key and the private key. Usually encryption goes with the public key, decryption goes with the private key. Right. So let's try to understand the concept in very abstract level. So then I will explain how it works in detail. So basically, when you want to do public key cryptography, first of all, the participants of this system should generate two keys, what we call it as public key and the private key. So basically, people who generated those two keys, they keep their private key private with them, right? And then they publish the other key in a public place. For example, let's say this is a public key ring of the bomb. Public key ring is actually key store of the bomb. This box key store may have the public key of other parties like Joy, Mike, Alice, Ted. So whoever want to communicate securely with Bob need to generate two keys and send their public key to this ring or this storage. So for example, if cousin want to create talk to the Bob, cousin has to generate public private keys. Cousin keep his private key with him and sends the public key to Bob. So Bob keep the public key in kind of a storage. So these public keys, as it means, they are public. Anyone can see those public keys. Private keys are, as it means, they are private. No one will see those details. So in the public key system, how it works, in the public key cryptography algorithm, it's similar to kind of a, maybe we can explain it very abstract level using some example like the safety boxes. So, you know, in the banks, there are safety boxes or what we call lockers. So those lockers operate with two keys. So how those lockers operate? We use one key to lock the box and the same key to open the box, right? Maybe you can consider it as so in the bank lockers, how it works, actually we use bank lockers operate with two keys. How it operates is, so basically the bank manager and the person who owns the account, they have to apply both keys. So those both keys used to lock and both keys used to open. But in the public key cryptography, we have special kind of lockers which use two keys. So there how it works, we use one key to lock the box, other key to unlock the box. So that public key cryptography algorithms are kind of boxes which operate with two keys. So how those two keys operate? If you use a one key to lock it, we need the other key to open it. If you use the second key to lock, we need to use first key to open. So some algorithms, public key cryptographic algorithms like RSA, so it goes opposite side as well. So for example, if whatever the key we use to lock cannot use to open the box, so we need to use other key to open the box. So that's how it works. Right. Assume now kind of Alice wants to get kind of confidential data from the Bob. So in this scenario, what Alice has to do, Alice sends this public key to the Bob. So then how the Bob do the encryption, Bob protect this document or what we call plain text using the Alice public key. So Alice must send the public key to Bob. So Bob encrypts it using his Alice public key. So then encrypted data will send to the Alice. So after it locks with the Alice public key, actually no one can open it because the key need to open that actually with the Alice. Right? What Bob can do, Bob can send that data to the Alice. Alice can use his private key to open that box and get the plain text. So you see this encryption, basically we use the public key of the recipient, not the sender. So in there, recipient should generate two keys, keep one key with them, that is called as a private key, and transmit the public key to the other party. So then the other party who wants to send the information has to use the public key, encrypt that data using that public key, and transmit to the remote party. So then he can apply his private key and get the information. So that's how the system works. So for example, if Bob wants to send the data to Mike, Bob has to use the public key of Mike and encrypt that data using the Mike public key and send to Mike. So Mike can then decrypt it using Mike's private key, right? So like that. So in this communication, each and every party need two key pairs. So then also when you consider about the public key, so if let's say when the Mike or the Alice send this public key to Bob in order to store this key ring, let's say someone take that public key at the middle. Do we need to worry about it? No, because if anyone can take that public key, but they cannot use that public key to decrypt the data. They can use that public key only for encryption of the data. So that is the advantage of this public key system. Obviously, you can understand. So with that, we solve the what we call it as key distribution problem, because we can send the public key through the same channel. Anyone can take that public keys where we don't need to worry about, because after anyone take this public key, so they can only do the encryption. They cannot do the decryption. They can only do the encryption. So anyone can take the public key and they can only do the encryption. So that's fine, right? So that solves our key distribution problem nicely. So public key system first used for solve this key distribution problem. There are people send their public key to the message senders. So message senders use those public key to encrypt that data and transmit. So the recipients can use their private key to decrypt that data and get it. Right. So let's have a look at the opposite operation. I said that, so those systems can be used in the reverse order. So for example, if you encrypt with the public key, we have to use private key to decrypt. Similarly, when you encrypt with the private key, we have to decrypt with the public key. It's opposite, it also works. So public key is used for encryption, private key needs for decryption. If private key used for encryption, public key needs for decryption. So do we need the opposite execution? So actually, opposite execution has very interesting requirements. For example, let's say the Bob encrypt that using his private key. If Bob encrypt the data using his private key, so which key we should use to decrypt it? Actually, we have to use the Bob's public key to decrypt it. So Bob public key with actually Alice, Mike, Ted, Joy, or maybe anyone else, because when the Bob sends his public key to Alice, someone else might take it as well. So we don't know who has taken this public key. Maybe Bob already sent to Joy, Mike, and Ted, plus someone also take it. So that means Bob's public key is public. Everybody knows about it. So Bob encrypt that data using his private key. Anybody who communicates in this network can decrypt that message. Obviously, if you should understand, obviously, there are no confidentiality in this scenario because anyone can decrypt the data. So, however, it has the most important security scenario, what we call it as authentication. Why? So Bob can decrypt it using private key of Alice can decrypt it using private key of Bob, not with some other key. So for example, if Bob encrypts it using his private key, so the Alice decrypt it using the public key of Bob, not the public key of Mike or George. So Alice can decrypt it using the public key of Bob, not using some other key. That proves Bob encrypted since it matched with the corresponding public key. So if anyone encrypts that data using their private keys, other parties can verify the party who created this message using corresponding public key. So that is how we're going to provide the authentication. So this concept further developed and we call it as digital signature. Right. So as you may understood, public key cryptography, they have several applications. One famous application is encryption and decryption. If someone wants to encrypt the data, so they have to use the public key of the recipient and then encrypt it using the recipient's public key. So then recipients can decrypt it using their private keys. So then public key cryptography can use for authentication, or what we call it as digital signature. In this digital signature scenarios, what we do, we encrypt the data using the private key of the sender. So these other parties or the world can then verify the authenticity using the public key of the sender. So basically in the digital signature, sender's key pair is used. Encryption and decryption, recipient's key pair is used. Right. In addition to these two things, public key cryptography can be used for key exchange. As you may understood when I move on, public key systems are use very heavy mathematics. Because of that, calculation of these encryption, decryption takes time. We may not be able to do directly encryption and decryption with the public key system. We only do encryption and decryption with public key, symmetric key system. So what practically we do the encryption and decryption with the symmetric key system, and that symmetric key we encrypt with the public key system. That is somewhat called as hybrid encryption. So there what we do as the senders, we kind of create symmetric keys, generate symmetric keys using public key system, and those symmetric keys some exchange with help of the public key system, and then these symmetric keys further used for encryption and decryption of the data. So that call it as key exchange. So as a summary, so public key system can be used for encryption, decryption, digital signatures, and key exchange. Right. So what are the requirements of public key cryptography? In the public key cryptography, we need to find it out. We need to find some method computationally easy to calculate, easy for a party B to generate key pair. We need to have some algorithm. So using this algorithm, we should be easily generate these two key pairs. So that should be the main requirement. If the key generation takes years, the algorithm may not work. We should have a fast method of generating public-private keys. Then we need to have easy for sender to generate ciphertext, obviously. So after they receive the public key, so the sender should be easily calculate the encrypted data, or what we call it as ciphertext. And then easy for the receiver to decrypt the ciphertext using its private key. That means after receiving the decrypted data, recipient should be able to decrypt it easily using their private key. Private keys are kind of a secret. Private keys are kind of a secret. By given some secret, recipient should be able to get back the ciphertext. Without giving the secret, recipient should not be able to get the plain text. Right. So in addition to that, so there are other requirements like computationally infeasible to determine the private key knowing the public key, because if the public key is public, everybody knows the public key, so then there should not be able anybody to find the private key. correspondent private key using the information available in the public key. If it is so, so anyone see the public key, so then they can create the private key out of the public key, and then after that they could decrypt the data. So actually for the key generation process, the key generator, the recipient should be able to generate those key pairs easily, and they send the public key. By looking at the public key, nobody will be able to find it out the private key back. So that is this requirement test. And then it says computation is feasible to recover the message name knowing the public key and ciphertext. Yes, because public key is known to anybody, so people encrypt that information using the public key. It creates the ciphertext. So everybody knows the ciphertext and the public key. By looking at the ciphertext and the public key, nobody will be able to get back the message if someone can get it. So that algorithm is not a good algorithm. So then either of two keys can be used for encryption with other used for decryption. So usually in the public key cryptography, we generate two keys, one key used for encryption and one key used for decryption. Let's say first key used for encryption, so that is then should send to the recipient, sender, so that call it as a public key. So then second key we keep private, so that call it as a private key. If you use the second key for encryption, so then that second key become a private key, right? So whatever this key is a private key. Whatever the key we distribute through the network, call it as a public key. So that's how this system works. So in the mathematically, there are three categories of public key cryptography algorithms are popular today. Starting from the first public key cryptography algorithm, Diffie-Hellman, and then the people invented this RSA cryptographic algorithm, and these days there are some other cryptographic algorithm, public key cryptographic algorithm, call it as elliptic curve or the ECC cryptographic algorithm. Diffie-Hellman or the DH cryptographic algorithm mainly developed for key exchange purpose. Diffie-Hellman algorithm use public key system used for key exchange. And then we have RSA public key cryptographic algorithm. RSA is the full scale of public key cryptography algorithm and we use for all three purposes. That means for encryption, decryption, digital signature, and key exchange. RSA can be used for all three, but Diffie-Hellman can only use for the key exchange purpose. And then there is another public key cryptography algorithm called elliptic curve public key cryptography algorithm. Elliptic curve public key cryptography algorithm together with the Diffie-Hellman is used for key exchange. Also, elliptic curve cryptography algorithm is used for digital signatures as well. So we will learn elliptic curve cryptography later on. Let's try to learn today Diffie-Hellman and maybe RSA cryptography algorithm. All those public key cryptography algorithms, we discussed the requirements. The requirements is by looking at the public key, we should not be able to find it out the private keys, but calculation should be easy. So it's this kind of functions we go in the mathematics we call it as trapdoor functions. Those trapdoor functions. So what we basically we can do this whatever apply function D and then convert whatever the data to the point R or the other function R. And then if reverse should be hard. However, if you know the secret, if you can do the reverse. So if you take the old story in this Aladdin, so we can take the Aladdin out or whatever, we can take the ghost out from the lamp, but if we want to put them back, we need to know the rest is secret. Similarly, if we can encrypt the data easily, but if you want to decrypt that data, we know that we should know the secret. So the secret is the private key. So that is basically what we call it as trapdoor function. So one of the major trapdoor function in mathematics is called it as decreased logarithm problem. So for example, if someone can calculate the log value of any number to the base, so by looking at this x or the answer, we should not be able to find it out what are the base and this exponent or whatever this calculated value. So you might think that is not it's not a hard problem or the trapdoor problem because someone can do it easily. So if someone can do it easily if you use small numbers. So if you use the large numbers, mathematician has proved that no one will be able to reverse it back. So based on this logarithm problem, two persons called Diffie-Hellman has created a protocol or the first public key cryptography system in the world called Diffie-Hellman or the DH public key cryptographic algorithm. So the paper published somewhere in 1976 which explains this Diffie-Hellman public key cryptographic algorithm. So this Diffie-Hellman public key cryptography algorithm based on this log calculation values, there basically we need to generate some two numbers called generator G and the prime number P, and then we need to generate some Q which less than P minus 1. So based on that, so system calculate public private keys. So they exchange the public keys. Using those public keys, system can derive a common symmetric key. So that's how this Diffie algorithm works. Let me explain in detail how those algorithm works. I'm not going to prove that. So in the practically, I will show you using some numbers how this Diffie-Hellman public key cryptography algorithm works. In the Diffie-Hellman public key cryptography algorithm, let's say there are two parties want to talk to each other. The name of these two parties A and B. And then there is intruder C wants to intercept the communication. So in this algorithm, first what the parties has to do, A and B has to do is they have to generate what we call generator G and the prime number P. Generator should less than P, prime P. So for example, to explain this algorithm, let's assume these A and B selected prime P as 70, and then they selected generator has 6, which is less than prime P 17. Right. So these two numbers A and B shared publicly. So attacker, whatever C, also see those two numbers. That's fine. Right. So that two numbers are part of the public key. Right. After that, so this protocol says A should generate a private key. So A's private key is simple X, some random number. Right. For simplicity, I assume Alice picked X equal 3. So that is Alice picked number 3 has his private key. So after that, Alice has to calculate the public key. So this is the equation to calculate the public key. So how do we calculate the public key? So we calculate generator to the power of private key modular P. Our generator number is 6. So we calculate 6 to the power of X. Our X or the private key is 3. So we calculate 6 to the power of 3 modular P. 6 to the power of 3 modular P. Right? So 6 to the power of 3 is 16. Modular 17 is 12. So then 12 is the public key of Alice. Right? So then Alice share his public key with the Bob. So Alice sends capital X, that is the public key of Alice to Bob. Right? So then the key generation of Alice is over. He has his private key, simple X, that is 3. He has his public key, capital X, that is 12. Right. So then in this system, Bob has to do the same. So Bob has to generate his private key first. So I assume Bob's private key is Y. So assume that is 5. So they use common generator, so G. So G is in this example 6. So Bob has to calculate 6 to the power of 5 modular P, that is 17. 6 to the power of 5 is 7,776. Modular 17 is 7. So the public key of Bob is then 7. So Bob sends his public key to Alice. Bob sends 7 to Alice. So then Bob created two key pairs. His private key is 5. His public key is 7. So he keeps his private key as a secret. He never sends to anybody. Alice also keeps his private key as a secret. that is free, he never sends to anybody. These two parties exchange only their public keys, that is 12 and 7. So the party C also aware about those public keys and generators and then numbers. The strength of this protocol, depend on by this attacker C or attacker Charles or whoever C looking for this should not be able to find it out those private key. For example, looking for by getting 12, he should not be find out this 3. So that is the secret, the strength of the algorithm. So with these two simple numbers, you might think the attacker will be able to calculate that. Obviously, yes. But in this protocol, not use that single numbers like 3, 7 for as their keys. They use 100-digit numbers as their keys. So if they use huge numbers as the keys, actually no one will be able to reverse them back. So that is the strength behind this algorithm, right? So they exchange their public keys so far. Now we have to learn how do they use those public keys and the private keys to do the key distribution. To do the key distribution. Key distribution refers to the way to send the key from Alice to Bob or Bob to Alice. Right? How do you do that? Using the Diffie-Hellman. Actually, in the Diffie-Hellman protocol, are not sending this symmetric key through the network. Instead, what they do, these two parties, A and B, independently create their key. Independently create their keys using the information which they exchange. So, for example, the information known by Alice is the public key of Y, private key of X, and obviously public key of X. Right? That's the information A knows. Information B knows is private key, that is private key, his private key, that is 5, and his public key, that is 17, and Alice public key 12. So these information only B knows. So using those information, Diffie-Hellman shows these two parties can independently create the key. How do they create the key? Algorithm to create the key, it looks like that. So Y is the public key of the recipient. We have to calculate public key of the recipient to the power of private key modulo P. So we can mathematically prove that is equal to G to the XY mod P. So similarly on the other side, so the other party has to calculate public key of his recipient, public key of his recipient to the power of private key modulo P. So that also ended up G to the XY modulo P. Both parties then ended up with the same number. Let's see whether it's true. So for example, in this Alice receives 7 as the public key. So this 7, capital Y equals 7. So then Alice has to calculate capital Y, that is 7, to the power of his private key. So then actually he should calculate Alice private key, public key is 7. He should calculate actually the 7 to the power of his private key. So I made a mistake here. Actually 7 to the 4 modulo 17. Alice picked 3. Let's pick 3 here. So we have to calculate 7 to the power of not a 4. There are no 4 here. So my slide, I made a mistake. I will correct that. Actually, it should be public key of 7 to the power of the private key. Alice private key is 3. 7 to the power of 3 modulo 17. When you do that calculation, you might see it ended up with the 3. Similarly, the other side, the Bob has to calculate public key of Alice, that is 2L to the power of private key. So public key of Alice is 2L, recipient is 2L to the power of his private key. Private key is 5 modulo 17. So when you do 12 to the power of 5, it's actually 248,832. And when you do modulo 17, you might see it ended up with 3. Actually, this one is not 4, it's 3. It's some type of mistake on the slide. Right. So we can show that. So by these two algorithms, both A and B can independently create their keys. So that's how Diffie-Hellman algorithm works. So that is the first public key cryptography algorithm. Diffie-Hellman algorithm only used for key exchange. How they are not exchanging the keys, actually they are exchanging the public keys, generating the keys independently. So that's what they do. However, in this Diffie-Hellman cryptography algorithm are vulnerable to the man-in-the-middle attack. That means someone in the middle can break this communication and force these two parties to generate a key with him. So then the two parties may not aware that whatever is public key is actually X public key. Instead of C can send his public key to B. So similarly, when B sends the public key Y, C keeps that and C can send C's public key to A. So then after receiving those numbers, A and B doesn't know whether A get the public key from B or B doesn't know whether he get the public key from A or C. Similarly, if A receives some number Y, A doesn't know whether he received that Y from B or attacker C. So that's called it as man-in-the-middle attack. That means when they exchange X and Y's in between, that means when they exchange their public keys, there should be a method of authentication those public keys. That means they should somehow know this is X definitely from A, not from C. So similarly, A should know this Y definitely from B, not from C. If they know each other about this, so then this system works fine. If they actually in the typical Diffie-Hellman algorithm, A and B don't get this information. A gets some number, B also gets some number. A doesn't know this number is really from B or C. B doesn't know this number is really from A or C. So because of that, we say this Diffie-Hellman algorithm is vulnerable to man-in-the-middle attack. So in order to solve this, you need to have authenticated Diffie-Hellman key exchange, or we need to do authentication while exchange their public keys. So basically for that, what we simply do nowadays, combining elliptic curve digital signatures with this. So in other words, we use digital signatures to exchange these two numbers. The digital signatures can do the authentication. So then after we receive those numbers, we have some evidence these numbers really from A and B. So if you do so, so then this algorithm is perfect. So actually most of the modern key exchange like TLS 1.2, so that's how your browser talks to the web server. TLS 1.2 protocol use Diffie-Hellman based key exchange nowadays. It was using Diffie-Hellman. After that, we were using RSA, and later we found that some practical problem called it as some issue with RSA called it as perfect forward secrecy issue. So I will discuss that later on. So because of that issue, we fall back again to the Diffie-Hellman. But Diffie-Hellman also has the issue, so that is man-in-the-middle attack. So we must solve that. How do we solve it? We create what we call it as authenticated Diffie-Hellman key exchange, right? So how it works, we will discuss later on. So in this stage, what you should understand is how this Diffie-Hellman key exchange works. So I guess you understood it, right? Now, let's move to the other public key cryptography algorithm, that is RSA algorithm. RSA is the dominant public key cryptography algorithm in the world. So RSA simply can use for all the three purposes which we discussed. That means encryption, decryption, and key exchange. Plus, we can use for calculate the digital signature. RSA properties RSA, main properties of the RSA actually based on calculation exponent product of these two large prime numbers. So RSA key generation, I will explain later on. It calculates some large number called n, that is the product of two large prime numbers p and q. So n is kind of public, and anybody knows this n. So the strength of the RSA depends on, we can't divide this n into the prime factors. So I will discuss it. Right. So RSA algorithm use a problem what we call it as prime factorization problem. So they use prime numbers. So actually they use prime numbers to generate keys. What is prime factorization? A prime factorization is the algorithm, the method to factor a prime number. Factor a number into a two prime factor. So for example, if there is a number n, we can factor it into the prime factors. So number 91, for example, prime factors are 7 multiplied 13. So RSA algorithm, this 91 is kind of public number. So the strength depends on, we cannot factor back this 91 into the prime factor. So when I say that, you might think I'm lying, because when you look at the 91, you can easily factor it to 7 multiplied 13. You understand that is 91 is 7 multiplied 13. So actually this factorization is possible. So this number is a small number like 91. If this number is a large number like 100 digit number, huge number, so factor this huge number into the prime factor is impossible real time. So the RSA depend on this equation, right? So in order to further understand how RSA works, we need to understand the other concept, what we call it as relatively prime numbers. The relatively prime numbers are the numbers which don't have common factors. If there are two numbers which they don't have a common factor, which call it as relatively prime number. For example, if you take 300, 2, 3, 5 are the factors, prime factors of 300. So when you take 800, 18, so 2 and 3 are the prime factors of 18. So then they have common prime factors, right? So then you see in there, so 318 have the common prime factor. So then 318 is not a relatively prime number. So for example, if you take any two prime numbers like 7 and let's say 13, so both are prime numbers, 7 and 13. So definitely they are not having common factors. So then any two prime numbers are relatively prime numbers because of that. So any two prime numbers are relatively prime numbers, right? So not only that, non-prime numbers, other numbers, sometimes relatively prime. So for example, maybe we can say like 8 and maybe 15. So 8 has a prime factor 2, right? And then 15 has a prime factor 5 and 3. So when you take 8 and 15, so 8 is not a prime number, but when you take 8 and 15, they are relatively prime numbers. They are relatively prime numbers, right? So any two numbers, if they don't have common factors, common prime factors, so they call it as relatively prime numbers. So the other concept what we would like to, what we are going to use is call it as greatest common divisor, GCD. GCD. Greatest common divisor is the largest common factor which any two numbers has. So for example, when you take 318, so GCD of 318 and 300 is actually 6. So 6 is the common factor, largest common factor of these two. Why do we need that for the RSA? I will explain it in a minute. Right. So next question which may come into your mind when you want to use RSA is whether we have enough prime numbers to use in these keys. So you know when you create RSA-based public-private keys, perhaps you know, those parties who communicate independently create those prime numbers or public-private keys. So when they create those numbers, they create them independently. They don't know, I create which number or you create what number. They don't know. They independently create those numbers. So if you have less set of prime numbers in the world, if two parties independently randomly generate those numbers, there is a high chance these two ended up with the same number. That means there is a high chance these two ended up with the same public and private keys. Can this happen? Actually, we can theoretically prove we have huge set of prime numbers in the world. Everybody in the world generate those keys, even we may get only very, very little chance two parties having the same prime numbers. Why? We have huge prime numbers range in the world. So in order to do this RSA calculation, actually we are not using small prime numbers like 7, 3, 5. Instead, we are using 100 digits number range, 100 to 200 digits, like huge number range. In this particular range, we have trillions of prime numbers available. So those prime numbers, because of that, can be used independently in order to calculate this RSA keys. So for example, these are the prime numbers, let's say 200, right? Right. So then we have to understand in little bit in detail the concept what we call greatest common divisor. Why this greatest common divisor is used to calculate the prime number. So when I ask you to calculate a prime number or find a given number is a prime, I think the algorithm you know is the way we divide a given number starting from 2 to the square root of that and see whether given, let's say given number is x, the best known algorithm you know, what we is the x modulo I equals 0. We check whether if given number, let's say given number is x, we check whether this x modulo I equals to 0. I goes from 2 to square root of x, right? So that's the algorithm. So if any I divide this x, obviously x is not a prime number. So we have to check that like that. So actually this algorithm which I explained is never going to work when you want to find prime numbers which 100 digits long, right? We need to have some other method of creating prime numbers. The other method based on this greatest common divisor. So one of the other methods. So let's try to understand how this greatest common divisor calculates. GCD is a common factor of two given numbers. Actually, a long time ago, a mathematician, great mathematician called Euclidean, has found a method to simplify the calculation of greatest common divisor. In this method, he proves any calculation of the greatest common divisor of any two large numbers can be simplified in a very short period of time using his Euclidean algorithm. So let's try to understand what that Euclidean algorithm means. It says if x divides a and b, what Euclidean proves, x also divides a minus k multiply b for every k. So that Euclidean proves. He proves that if a number called x divides by two other number called a and b, he proves that this number x also divides by this particular number a minus k multiply b for every k. So that's what he proves. Let's say whether we can prove that is simply. So for example, let's say we say suppose x divides both a and b, then we can write a equal x multiply a1 with any integer, right? If x also divides b, we we can write b equal x multiply some number. Suppose x divides both a and b, then we can write a equal x multiply a1, b equal x multiply b1. a1 and b1 is two integers, right? So we can write that like that. So what we have to prove, if this is equal, this also divides by x. How do we prove that? So we take this. Let's take this a minus k multiply b, a minus k multiply b. So it's equal to, let's replace a with x multiply a1, right? Then minus, k multiply, let's replace b with this. Then k multiply x multiply b1, because instead of b we can substitute x multiply b1. So then, so there is a common x, we can take x out. So we have ended up with x multiply a1 minus k multiply b. So if you take this, or a1, b1 and k are the integers, so then all together we can tell it like d. So that means it is x multiply d. That means whatever this particular number we consider here also divides by x. So that's Euclidean count. So why it is important? Why it is important? Because using that you can find a method to calculate the greatest common divisor of any two large numbers. So I will show you how to do that. So for example, I will show you with this number example how to do that. So for example, let's say we want to calculate the greatest common divisor of 1970 and 1066 using the so we can write that using this like this. For example, 1970 is equal 1 multiply small number 1066 plus 904. This is reminder part. We can write that. So based on the Euclidean algorithm, we can say if whatever the greatest common divisor is equal to x, if the greatest common divisor number x, actually the greatest common divisor of these two numbers. So that's Euclidean proof. For example, instead of calculating the GCD of these two numbers, we can calculate the GCD of 1066 and 904 based on the Euclidean algorithm. So Euclidean has proves greatest common divisor of this equal to greatest common divisor of these two numbers. So then this is a recursive algorithm. So for example, so then we can further write 1066 is equal to 1 multiply small number 904 plus 162. So if you write like that, we can prove GCD of this equal to this. So then GCD of this equal to that as well. Like that, we can recursively simplify this. So if you write it in the while loop, it's something like that. Euclidean algorithm using Euclidean algorithm, if you want to compute the greatest common divisor of A and B, what you have to do? We have to do while b greater than 0. If we take A mod B and we calculate instead of GCD A and B, we calculate GCD B and R. And then we repeat it until b greater than 0. So if you do that like there, so the last one is the greatest common divisor. Right. So why we need those things? Actually, the greatest common divisor is kind of a simple method where we can use to find it out the prime numbers. How? So in this GCD, what we can do basically, so let's say we want to randomly generate a prime number called P, right? So then what we do, after we generate a random number called P, and we want to find it out this number P is the prime. So that is our problem. So if you want to find that number P is the prime, we have to use, the best known method is, as I said, starting from 2, we have to divide that number P and see whether it's equal to 2. We take this number p modulo I equal to 0. If it is equal to 0, p is not a prime, right? We have to change from 2 to square root of this p. So if p is a large number, we can't do this. We can't do this. For that, greatest common device, now the GCD help us. How? So how it helps us? So let's say we generate a prime number p. Sorry, any number p, large number p, and we want to find this p is a prime. So then what we do, we create a random number called r, and then we calculate GCD of p and r. So if that GCD of p and r is equal 0, it's greater than 0. If the GCD of p and r is greater than 1, greater than 1, that means this p and r has a common factor, right? So in that means the number we generated, p, is not a prime number, right? I'll repeat. So we generate a large number, and we want to find it out that large number is a prime. So what we do, we generate another large number, and we calculate greatest common divisor GCD of these two large numbers. So GCD of two large numbers can be calculated in a short period of time using the Euclidean algorithm. So if that GCD is greater than 1, that means these two numbers has a common factor. That means this number p we generated is not a prime number, definite. So then we have to throw that number out and has to generate another random number and start doing the same. Okay. So what happened in the other way around? So for example, we generate number p, random number p, and we generate another number r, and we calculate GCD p and r. It is, let's say, 1. It is 1. Then that says this number p is prime? Actually not. That says this p and r is relatively prime. Right? If they are relatively prime, that doesn't mean p is a prime number. P might have a factor with some other r. So then what we should do, we generate another random number called r2 and calculate the GCD of p and r2. Assume that also 1. Then these two, p and r1, also relatively prime. That doesn't mean p is prime. So then we can repeat with r3. And then we can do with r4. Like we can do it maybe with r10,000. So after trying with maybe 100,000 r's, we get GCD of all r's equal 1. Then there is a high probability that p is a prime, right? So let's call it as a primality test, right? So in the primality test, what we do, we create p and r less than p and do this and see whether it's 1 for maybe many numbers, right? If it is 1 for many numbers, we can calculate the probability of p is to be a prime. So as shown in this slide. Similarly, in addition to this GCD, there is a function called Jacobi function. Mathematically, we can prove that using this Jacobi functions also, if this is equal to that, we can say this p might be a prime. So this calculation also says it might be a prime. This may say it also might be a prime. If we repeat that for kind of k times, we can say k times probability of p to be a prime like that. So that mathematically we can prove. So that is help finding a prime number in statistical way, right? So we actually find prime numbers using that statistical method. So since we need to find a huge prime numbers, we cannot use the regular method of finding prime numbers. We must use this statistical method of using prime numbers, finding prime numbers. Okay. Right. Just to give you a feeling. So actually OpenSSL is one of the package which we use to create those keys and so on. Using this OpenSSL, we can find it out those prime numbers, right? So they use the method which I explained. So they are not using this try and error method, like dividing it, taking the word method. And if they try to do so, it takes a lot of time. For example, maybe you can write a program to find it out this huge number as a prime number. Maybe you can try. So you might see that your method or the well-known method of finding prime numbers, that if that apply to find the prime number, to find whether this given number is prime or not, find this whether this given number is prime or not, you apply your well-known method, it may take minutes of doing it. But I will show you in a minute. So OpenSSL will determine this is a prime number or not in millisecond time interval. How do they do that? They use, as I said, they use this probabilistic text using greatest common divisor function. All right. Okay. So now let's have a look on the RSA algorithm. RSA invented by these three people in somewhere around 1997. So 2002 they won a kind of Turing Award for their invention. It's kind of the best invention in this century, kind of. Right. Let me explain how this RSA algorithm works in detail, little detail. In the RSA algorithm, first we say we need to generate two large prime numbers. So that is called as P and Q. Right? So then we have to calculate the product of these prime numbers. So this P multiplied Q. So let's say this is N. So if our P and Q are 100 digit numbers, our N is kind of 200 digit numbers. So if someone can factorize this 200 digit number N back to this P and Q, RSA has broken. So still we don't know some algorithm by looking at N to find it out this P and Q. You might think it's a simple problem, but it is not a simple problem. It is a simple problem if N is small. If N is 200 digit number, it's not a simple problem, right? So after these two steps, what the RSA algorithm says, we need to select an integer is relatively prime to P minus 1 multiply Q minus 1, right? So the simple way of doing it is to find another prime E, which less than this. If you find another E prime number, that definitely relatively prime. So we find another prime number. So then there are three prime numbers to be generated in this RSA key generation process. After that, we need to select another number D which satisfies this equation. What is the equation? E multiply D modular P minus 1 multiply Q minus 1 equal to 1. So we have to, we generate actually P and Q, then we know what is P minus 1 Q minus 1, and we know what is the multiplication of these two, and we generate another E, that is another prime number. So then we find some way D. When you do this calculation, it should be equal 1, right? So what these three people shows to the world, if you can find some E and D which satisfy this equation, they have proved that these two equations are correct. What is these two equations? So this is called as encryption equation. This is called as decryption equation. So the encryption equation tells that any plain text P to the power of E modular N, and the answer C is the ciphertext. So that's how we do encryption in RSA. So P is our plain text. So maybe if you want to encrypt capital A, our P is 65. ASCII value of capital A may be 65. So then our P is 65. So then 65 to the power of E is a large prime number. This is 100-digit number. So 65 to the power of 100-digit number modular N. N is 200-digit number. So answer is our ciphertext. So as you may understand, this is huge calculation. Huge calculation. So we get back the ciphertext. We get the ciphertext. So then how do you get the plain text? So this is our plain text algorithm. In the plain text algorithm says ciphertext to the power of private key, that is D mod N. So we get ciphertext. Ciphertext to the power of D, we find this D. Ciphertext to the D modular N, we will get back the P. That's what they prove. They prove if we can find such E and D, these two are correct. So we call D as the private key, E as the public key. So both with D and E, we should know the N. So then after the key generation, what we do as the key generator, let's say I generate these keys, then I should keep D and N as my private key with me. I should never tell anyone this D. Then I distribute E and N, this large prime number and multiplication of this 2 prime P and Q, that is N, to the rest of the world. E and N consider as my public key. The party who wants to send the information using my public key E should calculate this and send this ciphertext C to me. So then I apply my decryption equation with my private key D and get back the plain text. So you might understand that is very huge calculation. So those take time. Other thing you should understand, so this N is common to the public and private key. That is, any public party who knows the public key also knows the N. So if this party can factor this N to the prime factors called P and Q, then they can know P minus and Q minus 1. They already know the public key. They know this equation, so they can find the D. That means if someone finds a method to factor N into the prime factors, they can calculate the private key D. So as you understood, the strength of this RSA based on this factoring this number N. If someone will able to factor this number N to the prime factors, RSA cannot use anymore. Right. So as I said, how the RSA works. So for example, let's say there is a person called Kamal. He generates public private key as I mentioned. So then he can publish his public key, that is E and N, in some published place. So then if Amal wants to send some information to Kamal, Amal first should fetch the public key of Kamal, that is E and N, and then he has to calculate his message to the power of E modular N, that is ciphertext C, and then transmit through the network. So that network receives to this person Kamal. So then Kamal can decrypt using his secret key D or the private key D by calculating C to the power of D modular N. Then Kamal get back the message, okay. So that's how Kamal do the decryption. In order to understand this works, let's try to do it with some numbers. So this RSA algorithm works with any numbers, right? Any prime numbers, not only the large prime numbers, even small prime numbers. So that's true. So in order to see how it works, let's take some numbers and do the calculation. So for example, in the RSA key generation, it says find 2 prime numbers, P and Q. So we find P11, Q17. So then it says calculate n, p multiply q. So then 11 multiply 17 is 187. So that is my n. So then we need to select another integer e relatively prime to p minus 1 q minus 1. P is 11, p minus 1 is 10, q is 17, q minus 1 is 16. So then p minus 1 multiply q minus 1 is 160. So we need to find the number relatively prime to 160. Easiest way is we generate another prime. So that is, we can select our e as prime number 7. Fine. Then we need to find the number which satisfies this equation. So we find 23. We found that 23 satisfies that. Let's see. So we need to calculate e multiply d, that is modular this. 23 multiplied 7 is 160. So this is 161. 23 multiplied 7 is 161. This is 160. 161 modulo 160 is 1. So yes, it's satisfied. So if that satisfies, we can prove this is work. These two equations work. So that means whenever we calculate plain text to the power of p, that is plain text to the 7 modulo n, we can get back the ciphertext. So when we calculate ciphertext to the power of d modulo n, that is ciphertext is whatever ciphertext to the power of d is 23 modulo n, we will get back the plain text. Next we can see. You use any number for p and do the calculation, you may see it works. I can get more examples like here. So for example here, so let's say recipient knows this is a D private key 23 and 187, right? So the different example, let's say this example. So then my private key is 23 together with n is 187. My public key is 7 together with n, that is 187, right? So recipient knows the private key. In this example, private key is 23 and 187, that is E, D and N, right? So in this example we calculated, and this is private key, public key is 7. So the sender who sends the information to this particular recipient knows this private key, public key. This by example, public key is 7 and 187. 7 is E, E7, N is 187. So this is my public key. So this is private key, this is public key. 187 is my N, common to public key and private key both. Right. In this example, let's say sender wants to send message M, that is 88, to this recipient. So he has to calculate message 88 to the power of public key modulo n. So message is 88, public key is 7, 88 to the power of 7 modulo 187. So we can simplify this calculation further like that. And finally, you may notice answer is 11. So we can calculate those separately and then put them together and calculate it using modular arithmetic. So basically, you see, if you do this calculation, answer is 11. So that means ciphertext of 88 is 11, right? How do I decrypt it? In order to decrypt, we need to calculate ciphertext to the power of private key modulo n. My ciphertext now is, what is my ciphertext? 11. So then I have to calculate ciphertext to the power of private key, that is 11 to the power of private key modulo n. So we can simplify this calculation like that. After do this calculation, you can see we are ended up with 88. That is our plain text, right? So this is ciphertext to the power of private key modulo 187. let's calculate it. You can calculate yourself. You might see we ended up with 88. That is how RSA encryption decryption works. Right. So I will continue this lecture with some more examples in the next week. Before I conclude, I would like to show you this my simple example of this prime number, calculation of prime numbers. Right. Right. Let me share my terminal. Give me a minute. Right. To share the terminal. Right. So if in case you want to calculate prime numbers, let's say less than 200, we can use this script, shell script, where it calls the open SSL in the loop from 1 to 200. And if it is a prime, they print that on the terminal. So let's run this script. So this script will show us the prime numbers, 200 prime numbers, first 200 kind of prime numbers. So kind of if you want to find it out, first 2000 prime numbers, kind of 2000 prime numbers, you can write like that. So you see this OpenSSL will very fast generating or finding out the prime numbers. So the algorithm, you know, the simple algorithm cannot use to do this. So similarly, if someone want to find a huge number is a prime or not, so OpenSSL has this probabilistic method based on GCD, which I explained. So you say I want to calculate, I want to see whether this is a prime. So I do OpenSSL prime and give a number. It says it's not a prime. So we can write like that, any number like that. Say not a prime, right? So like any huge numbers, like 100 digits number, like this, it's not a prime, right? So you see, maybe you can write a program and see whether your program can determine whether this huge number is a prime or not. If you try to do that, you might take maybe days. But you see, OpenSSL do it in seconds, like any huge number, like that, maybe 100 digits, 100 digits numbers, like that. So still not a prime number, right? So how do they do this calculation fast? Using this statistical test, which I explained, right? So usually RSA use 100 digits number. It's larger than this number which I type here. So 100 digits number. So and then they use multiply together. It's get 200 digits number, and then do calculate power plain text to the power of this 200 digits number modular 200 digits number. It's a huge calculation. So that's why I said the so public key system kind of slow system. So if you practically want to use, you need to combine this RSA with the symmetric key system. So we will discuss when you move on how to do that, and so on. We will discuss, right? So I would like to conclude the lecture today here. So I will share you the slides during the weekend, and based on the things which we learn in today, I will share some activities. Maybe I will give you some assignments this week to calculate Diffie-Hellman key exchange. So you can write a program to calculate Diffie-Hellman keys. So send a resistant program. I will show you. I will share you these assignments during the weekend.